The way that conservatism was defined was this, the opposite of conservatism is radicalism. The example in the 18th century was a kind of left-wing radicalism. But just because that was the example, the practical example that exists, it doesn't mean that the inherent logic of the philosophy wouldn't apply to something that identifies on the right too. It doesn't matter if you frame yourself as conservative and you dress up, you cosplay as a conservative if you like, and you identify as a conservative and you believe that you're a conservative. As soon as you are tearing down institutions, then what exactly are you conserving?
Welcome everyone to the Babylon Cast. As always, I'm one of your hosts, Vern, alongside my good friend and my co-host, Bruce. Bruce, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very, very well. Very much looking for this conversation with a friend of ours.
Yeah, we have the pleasure of having the very lovely, very illustrious, very prestigious Mike Burke. Mike Burke is a self-proclaimed conservative liberal. He's a fellow for the Institute for Liberal Values and one of the hosts for the Dissidents, an Institute for Liberal Values podcast. And you can find his writings on New Discourses, Queer Majority, and Providence. Link of all of which, the links will be in the description of the video below. Mr. Burke, how are you doing today?
Very well, sir. I'm absolutely being destroyed by the Tokyo heat. I'm living in Tokyo, and I think I went outside and it was 40 degrees with something like 80% humidity. Yeah, your sweat just sticks to your skin and it doesn't evaporate, so you just kind of slowly cook. It's a nightmare. If you're gonna come to Japan, like unless you're in like northern Hokkaido and then it's all fine and cool and the rest of it at this time of year, don't come in the summer. Like late spring is just about doable. Early spring is glorious. Winter is fabulous, especially if you like skiing or snowboarding. Autumn is also great. Just do not come in June, July, August, or really September either.
That's really good news to hear, because I'm planning to visit Japan in a few months. Like there's a swordmaster's village in Graveside that I really want to see. So I just spend a lot of time on the outside, so it's not like the heat is something I want to avoid. So not now. Good.
Not now, Bruce.
Yeah.
No, definitely not now. You really, it's not really safe to go outside for any considerable period of time.
Okay.
Yeah, you'll feel sick.
Oh.
It's not like, if it's 40 degrees in Australia or somewhere like that, you just make sure you drink enough water and you get enough electrolytes in your system, because you're going to sweat them out.
Wow.
And it won't be comfortable, but you'll be okay. In Japan, with the humidity as high as it is, it's much, much, much worse, because again, your sweat just doesn't go anywhere. It just stays on your skin. So yeah, it's really not safe to be outside for long periods of time. Funnily enough, the construction workers that you see here have air-conditioned jackets.
Air-conditioned.
So they have yeah, it's amazing. So have like a jacket with like actual air conditioning units built into the jacket.
Okay.
With like fans spinning around at the back and stuff, like almost like a. Yeah, like it's almost like like a space marine, like the power armor. But yeah, they have these little fans in the back, and it literally circulates the air around in them, so it cools them down. Yeah, so they have to do that, because otherwise they're just dying. It's getting worse every year, of course. So.
Dang, that's pretty cool. Oh, it should be said also, I think the vast majority of our audience do come from civilized countries who have landed a man on the moon. So 40 degrees Celsius, for the people in those countries, it's like about 4 like over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It's insanely hot. That's crazy.
It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. Yeah, not good.
Yeah, but anyways, we're very happy to have you on. We've spoken before. We've spoken largely about our dismay of the current state of liberalism, and I'm curious, I kind of as a preamble, and for those uninitiated with your work, and also for our own personal self-indulgence, how did your life trajectory go about, as where you're now here defending liberalism? Have you had an interesting political evolution in terms of your thoughts about how society ought to work, and then what kind of ultimately led you down this academic route?
Sure. So I mean, I think I started off as I want to say precocious. As a kid, like I read a lot. I wasn't considered to be academically gifted at all as a kid. Quite the contrary, in fact. For example, my school had a trip to the local university, and I wasn't allowed to attend on the basis that it would be completely unthinkable that I would ever attend any university as even an undergraduate. I mean, that was how badly I was perceived. And to be fair, I didn't behave well, but I don't know. As somebody who teaches at university, I kind of think that, you know, teaching is easy if you have highly motivated students all of the time who are paying attention. It's more difficult if you don't, but that's your job and you've got to do something. But I mean, I was completely rejected initially by the educational system. But in my teenage years, I picked up, you know, the pamphlet that is the Communist Manifesto. Um, that made a lot of sense to me then because I was a kid and therefore an idiot. Um, and well, I mean, you know, kids
Yeah, young
can
and
be
dumb,
bright.
young and dumb.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know,
Right. Yeah,
kids have the intellectual horsepower, if you like. Like if you draw the parallel between a CPU, you know, you can have a really powerful CPU, and that's great. It's capable of doing a lot of things, but you also need some decent software to be built on that.
yeah,
And the Communist Manifesto is not a great piece of software. I mean, it's only a tiny work anyway. It's not like the volumes of Capital that are kind of almost impossible to navigate.
yeah.
But you know, the Communist Manifesto is a simple thing, and it's a very alluring thing. So I think as a kid, in my early teens, you know, 13, 14, 15, I was drawn to radical Marxism. And I kind of regarded that as a stage of puberty. like an intellectual stage of puberty. It was like kind of a developmental thing that I think lots of people go through. Um, and then I think by my late teens to early 20s, I moved over to left-leaning liberalism. And as I've got older, I've drifted over towards conservatism. But when I say conservatism, I mean conservatism as a coherent philosophical position,
Yeah.
as advocated for originally by Edmund Burke. What we would call conservative today often is, you know, the complete antithesis of that.
Yeah.
And that underlines a lot of the writing that I'm doing at the moment, particularly for New Discourses, where I'm looking at some of the most prominent, I'm going to put quotation marks in case you're listening via audio, but heavy emphasis on the quotation marks, you know, conservative philosophers, people who identify with conservatism, who invoke the key names of conservatism, but actually pretty blatantly and flagrantly violate the core principles as they were advocated for by Edmund Burke, and even more recently by you know, the recently deceased Roger Scruton, who I think is very much an heir of that tradition. So we're seeing a betrayal of conservatism in the same way I think that we saw a betrayal of liberalism,
Yeah.
you know, with the authoritarian woke, who would often claim to be liberal, even if though their key texts didn't claim to be liberal. Most of the time, they would claim to be liberal regardless, but they were anything but liberal. And again, I would emphasize that conservatism and liberalism are true. Conservatism and liberalism are two sides of the same coin. Very much. They're not the opposite of each other, as many people would have you believe.
I would agree with that because, like, I think in some of our offline conversations we talked about the idea about how classical liberalism has been betrayed, but like I also see the reverse being done to the ideas of conservatism, in which, like, you know, something that is a phrase that hasn't gotten popular yet, but because of how the woke right is, how things are with the woke right are going, I see the phrase classical conservatism is coming into the picture, and these two. I don't want to say they're diametrically opposed, but these two counterbalances are increasingly ignored by these extremes in a cultural dialogue, and that's something that should be cause for concern for all of us.
Oh, absolutely, and it's worth kind of pointing out what the opposite of conservatism is, right? So the opposite of conservatism is radicalism. So the key example for Edmund Burke, when he wrote the Reflections on the Revolution in France in the 18th century, was the French Revolution, was the Jacobin movement, you know, who looked at, well, people like Paine, Thomas Paine, who inspired them, would look at the United Kingdom at the time, England specifically, and point out all of the things that he liked about England, and then try and kind of distill using reason alone to try and distill the things you like and cut it away from the things that you maybe don't like for example, a constitutional monarchy or an aristocracy, and then to believe that you can wipe away the old order completely, and just from new cloth create something new that will automatically be better. And Burke said that that was folly. He said that the kind of system that had evolved in England, which I would call liberal, he didn't use that term because it wasn't in use in that sense at the time. I mean, he was definitely a liberal. If you look at his voting record in Parliament, you know, he spoke against abuses of power in India. He was in favor of religious freedom. He was supportive of the rights of the colonists in America, and he was also, you know, a really big opponent of the slave trade. So, you know, very, very liberal, certainly for his time. So he would have, you know, the way that conservatism was defined was this, you know, the opposite of conservatism is radicalism. Now, the example in the 18th century was a kind of left-wing radicalism. But just because that was the example, the practical example that exists, it doesn't mean that the inherent logic of the philosophy wouldn't apply to something that identifies on the right too. Especially when that thing that is on the right is going about tearing down institutions left, right, and center, just like the Jacobins did. You know, the Jacobins and would have pointed out all kinds of problems with the you know, the French regime of the time, and a lot of their observations were correct. But it doesn't follow that you can just rip the whole thing up and make something immediately better, because, as Burke said, it would turn into a bloodbath, and it did turn into a bloodbath. And when you see the radical right, I mean, I wouldn't say that they're right at all, right? Because they've divorced themselves from conservatism. If they're, it doesn't matter if you frame yourself as conservative and you dress up in you cosplay as a conservative, if you like, and you identify as a conservative and you believe that you're a conservative. As soon as you are tearing down institutions, then what exactly are you conserving? I mean, I don't believe that any of these people have any right to call themselves conservative. If they want to say that they're right-wing radicals, I wouldn't even say they have any right to call themselves right. But if they want to say that they're radicals, and well, I wish they'd just be honest about it, because they're not conservative. There's nothing conservative about them.
One of the things that I constantly say, or that I'm constantly worried about, I actually recently said it to Bruce right before you hopped in, is that people love to define themselves based on things that they hate rather than based on things that they stand up for. So someone like Donald Trump, for example, and the MAGA movement in general, they're not conservative by any stretch of the imagination. They're not conservatives. They're radicals. They're tearing
Quite.
down every institution rather than conserving them, or at the very least, rather than conserving the positive aspects, the fact-checking aspects of it that they presumably would like, but they're not doing that. But because people are prioritizing, focusing on the things that they hate, they're choosing to define themselves based on that, like, you know, the crazy woke lefts that they despise. That's their primary definition, rather than any conservative, because they all still call themselves conservative, or at least probably, like, you know, on average, they still call themselves conservatives. But what exactly is conservative about what it is that they're aspiring to? Do you I'm curious, do you think that, what do you think happened there? Because that's my analysis. My analysis, it could be sophomoric. It's just like, you know, obviously it's a multivariate equation, but I'd say like the center of mass leans towards this idea that like people just really hate the woke left and they're willing to jump on board with Trump. And obviously there's going to be other things like, you know, geopolitical grievances that they have that isn't being met by the neoliberal establishment that they so despise. But what's your analysis as to like why is it that you see these self-proclaimed conservatives defending what seems to be the opposite of conservatism?
Well, so I think we have to draw a line between Trump on the one hand and this kind of woke right movement, MAGA movement on the other, because there are schisms beginning to show that. Say whatever you like about Trump, I'm not a fan of the man, never have been, but he's not an ideologue. Whereas the woke right very much do seem to be ideologues. So what's driving them? So, I mean, I've written on this.
Should we explain what the woke right is first, maybe?
Yeah, do you want to go ahead and do that, or would you like me? Or
let's go down that right, actually, because for the longest time, like, on this channel and stuff, and many other like liberal venues, the the target of focus has been like on the woke left, right? Where depending on who you ask, people who are woke could be someone who is just normally, literally in like the actual definition that it was constructed during when it was created in laws, like you're woke to these grievances, these injustices that exist, and then it's been used pejoratively by some people as like, either people who just see racism where there is none, or a much more fluent definition or philosophically fluent definition by people like James Lindsay and others who write for New Discourses, where it has much more to do with like postmodernism and Marxism and this deconstructive language.
Right.
And for the longest time, that was the center focus of the conversation. But as of late, certain people have been getting in a lot of trouble for criticizing what has been dubbed by the woke right. And I think you're a great person to ask about this. And so I guess I'm curious, how would you define the woke right? Because this is a very contentious term
Sh-
from what I've
sure.
seen.
It shouldn't be. But I mean, the reason why it is just, the same time the woke left were running around saying, no, woke isn't a thing. It doesn't exist. Really, it's not a thing. It's not a thing at all. And the woke right are doing exactly the same thing right now, which is kind of funny. Um, I would define the woke left and the woke right by critical theory. So critical theory begins in an essay, I think it was from the 1930s, by a chap called Horkheimer. And he wrote an essay on traditional theory versus critical theory. I think it was just Horkheimer alone. He would then work with Adorno. He might have wrote it with Adorno, but I don't think so. I think he wrote that stuff later. And so the idea was that traditional theory is, your theory that explains things. So economic theory, any kind of theory that is looking at the world and trying to explain how X causes Y. Critical theory, on the other hand, was something that would understand at a fundamental basis that the fabric of society is, or at least society as it exists now, is fundamentally oppressive, and therefore it has this kind of motivated reasoning inbuilt into it to find out what the cause is, not to question the oppression, but to find out what the causes of that oppression is. And the idea is that the way in which you're oppressed is not immediately obvious. So, I mean, I can draw this out in an example if you like, because there is something to it to a degree. So, I mean, the classic example would be, let's imagine that you are a factory worker in America in the 1950s. Okay, so the economy is doing rather well following World War II. You own enough money, you earn enough money to have a reasonably nice house, a car, maybe go on holiday once a year. And what you do when you finish your day's work, you go home, you drop past the liquor store, I think you call it in America, the off license as we call it in the UK. You buy yourself a six-pack of beer, and then you sit down in front of TV and you have your consciousness occupied by whatever American TV was popular in the 1950s. I have no idea. So your faculties, which could be used to understand that actually your labor is worth more than you're being paid for, are being suppressed by the alcohol and the TV. And then critical consciousness would be this idea that you start to become aware of this. You start to become aware that not only is your faculties being diminished by the beer and the television, but that you're worth something more. And then the whole point of that critical consciousness is then to kind of start to fight towards that better state of society. And I think this is what unites the woke left and the woke right. So the woke right now believe that America, the United Kingdom, are constructed now in ways that are deliberately made to disenfranchise white men, specifically. And they are awake to this. And if you don't believe this, if you think that, for example, racism against black people is more of a problem than racism against white people, that you are asleep. and I think that's really what defines them. That kind of idea of this critical consciousness. They have this critical consciousness. They are aware in a way that you are not.
It's the reverse
Does that make
critical
sense?
consciousness that empowers the woke left. It's like that. What how I envision these are just conspiracy theories that fuel a certain victimization narrative, um,
Absolutely.
on the left and on the right. The left being, like, if you're a minority, you're oppressed by default. On the right, if you're white, if you're Christian, you're oppressed by default. Neither one of these are neither one of these are true. There may be nuances that have to be
Well,
considered, but the
I,
general narrative is not true.
well, I mean, I think you might be going a bit too far by saying it's not true. Um, have you seen The Exorcist, the movie?
No, I haven't, but I use the word deliberately, like, nuances. Maybe I was speaking a little bit too generalistically, anyway, go ahead, please.
Yeah,
So,
The Exorcist is my favorite horror film, so I'm very excited to see where you're
okay,
going with this.
done. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. So there is. I love. I think The Exorcist is one of the finest movies of all time.
Likewise.
And it's Father Michael and Father Damien, isn't it? Max von Sydow plays Father Michael. Am I right? The older
You know
guy.
more than I do already.
Okay. So the old priest, he's with the Finnish accent, I think. Obviously not American. And then there's the younger priest, who I think is Father Damien. I might be getting the names mixed up. But anyway, the older priest and the younger priest. And the older priest is really experienced. He has been through many exorcisms before. He knows his shit. And the younger priest has encountered this demonic possession, and he has faith, he has passion, he wants to go and do the exorcism, but he doesn't have that experience and knowledge. And what the older priest says to the younger priest is essentially along these lines. We may ask the demon what is pertinent, but we must be careful. The demon is a liar, but he likes to confuse us. He will mix lies with the truth. The effect is powerful and psychological, so don't listen. And that's but it's a fan, and this is how propaganda works, right? And this is how a lot of ideology works. Are there examples of horrific racism against Black people in the United States of America? Historically, absolutely. Do they persist today? Well, probably not in elite institutions like Harvard or the university space, but yeah, I imagine it is still a big problem in parts of the United States. Similarly, are there examples of white people being unfairly targeted because they are male, cis, and white? Well, I mean, it's happened to me. I mean, I've been targeted and had my reputation basically stamped on because I was described as a cis white het male, and therefore I was, automatically a homophobe. So when you talk to these woke people, and similarly to people on the left, it's not. I don't think it's the best approach to say that everything you see is entirely invalid. There is legitimate grievance in there. But what it is, and what we saw certainly with the woke left, and we can begin to see this now with the woke right, that legitimate grievance was taken, was magnified, was exaggerated, and then was used as the basis of invention of illegitimate grievances left, right, and center. And I think that with the woke right, what we're seeing is, again, there have been people who have been treated fucking abysmally by the woke left, and institutions that should have known better, staffed by people who in many cases did know better but were too cowardly to do anything about it. Both the individuals in those institutions and the institutions themselves have acted abysmally to a whole host of people, including myself. I know how that feels, and I've helped people out with this, with the excesses of the woke left. And I think it is that legitimate grievance that is now being mixed in with lies that you can. And here's the classic one, right? So we've seen the emergence of wokery. We've now seen the emergence of let's exclude it from the woke right at the moment, but we've seen the emergence of MAGA as a kind of pendulum swing against wokery. So a philosopher like Yoram Hazony, for example, who's one of the most influential pseudo right wing, and I'd say pseudo because there's nothing right wing or conservative about him, apart from kind of like his identity and the labels that he uses, would say, okay, so wokery was perhaps the first nail in the coffin of liberalism, and then the 2016 election of Donald Trump showed that liberalism is dead, and that we need to, out of new cloth, make a whole new political order, right? Patrick Deneen is another one who suggests this, another very influential right-wing philosopher. Again, right-wing in quotation marks. That's what they argue. But I would say that as messy and as horrible as MAGA is, the very emergence of MAGA as a movement, you don't have to like it, and I don't like it, itself shows that liberalism is still alive, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. The whole point of liberalism is that it works, but it's always messy. And if you see the emergence of a movement pushing back against the woke left and perhaps coming up with their own excesses, that isn't a sign that liberalism is dead. It's a sign that it's working, and working how it's always worked, which is very messily.
Mike, I think what you said there is perfectly legitimate, and I apologize for the broad use of language I used earlier. Like, you pretty much put into words what I come out to say. I just want to back up and say, like, when I said it wasn't
Sure.
true, I didn't mean it in such a broad perspective.
Yeah.
Just like what we've gotten used to from the woke left and the woke right over the last couple of years. That's why I put it the way I did. So I apologize for that.
Mm-hmm.
But the one of the reasons we wanted to speak to you about this is, and, I'm not as familiar with the woke right as I am with the woke left, but I am aware of a lot of the similarities we see between these two movements, so to speak. Like, the historical revisionism. You see this on people mentioned on the Joe Rogan podcast, like Ian Carroll and Daryl Cooper, who cast Winston Churchill as the villain of World War II, and it's really analogous to see how we see Nicole Hannah-Jones pushing the 1619 Project as a narrative to smear the creation of the United States as a state dedicated to upholding slavery. Now, she's openly said, and I have snapshots of this, that her work is not objective. And we see, again, on the woke right, these comedians just they make a claim that they can't really defend, but they just back up and say, like, I'm just asking questions. But these questions aren't questions. They're just leading statements with implied answers. And, that's concerning, because on the left, we've seen how popular Nicole Hannah-Jones' work is, very popular with the woke regressive leftists, for reasons that you eloquently spell out earlier. And, like, one of the things I really want to ask you, and woke right is something that's, at least I think it is relatively newly identified. How badly has this historical revisionism really made inroads with the right, especially since, like, we got people who have large followings like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens? How badly has this infected the right the way it infected the left, in your opinion?
Oh, it's absolutely horrific, and it's worse. I mean, the classic ahistorical example. I mean, like, for me, I mean, if you Churchill was a flawed man, but if you really look into the life of Churchill, it's pretty clear that the bloke was a fucking hero. I mean, he was a very, very brave chap indeed. The thing that really, 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 really pisses me off about the woke right, and this is probably their core philosophical claim. So the key thing that they want to argue is that liberalism has failed. And by liberalism, they would mean traditional conservatism, which would be my thing. Traditional conservatism, if you live in the UK or anywhere in the Anglosphere, by the way, is liberal, because that's what defines our societies. So if you're going to conserve the key values of an Anglospheric country, you are conserving liberal values, because that's really what defines us. So they would say all of that's failed, but they would say that they would do something that Horkheimer and Adorno did in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, which to say that the seeds of liberalism's destruction were sown into the very ideological DNA of it. Patrick Deneen talks about, again, one of their key philosophers. He says that liberalism hasn't been a failure; it's been very successful, and that it's delivered some good things, but that it ultimately ends up with this kind of atomistic individualist society in which the spiritual or social familial bonds that keep us together as a people have been degraded by the unpacking of liberalism. But by making this argument, they fundamentally misunderstand what liberalism is, fundamentally get it completely confused. Another one would be Carl Benjamin on the Lotus Eaters, who used to define himself as a classical liberal and was a very sensible bloke for many years. He would say that liberalism, that the end ideological point of liberalism is communism, right? The assumptions, the central assumptions of liberalism and communism are more or less the same, which I think is complete nonsense from an ideological point of view. But it misses the most key point, which is that liberalism is not an ideology. Liberalism might be an ideology. Liberalism can be an ideology in the sense that you can talk about it with abstract language. For example, in the way that John Stuart Mill did on liberty. But liberalism as it really existed is something that evolved from the bottom up. It's something that evolved over generations in the UK, in England, and then continues to evolve in England to this day, and has continued to evolve in the United States too. It's not this kind of abstract ideological blueprint. And the reason why this is obviously true is because the people who made these abstract ideological blueprints that they criticize, like the likes of Mill or the likes of Thomas Paine, were reflecting upon societies that already existed. John Locke was reflecting on a society that already exists, right? So liberalism can't be this abstract ideological blueprint, right? It can be in an abstract sense, but the liberalism that exists, the liberalism that is lived in the world today, cannot be that abstraction, because the abstraction has to be second in a temporal sense, right? You have to have something to reflect on. And this is specifically the mistake that they make. So when you think about the key liberal values in society, let's say property. Okay, so how do you learn about property? Do you learn about private property from a court? Do you learn about it from the police? The way in which a child, and this is something that is inculcated into us as children, by the way, and like a key appreciation and understanding of private property, is as a kid, and I would have done this, I don't remember doing this, but I would have done it. Vern, Bruce, both of you would have done this, and I don't know if you have kids or if you're going to have kids, or even if you don't have kids, you will probably participate in this socialization process at some point in your life. The way that we learn private property is you see a toy that is not yours, you snatch that toy from another child's hand, the other child also wants the toy, that child cries, that immediately gives you emotional feedback, right? Because you think, oh, I've taken something and the child is crying, I don't want that child to cry. Then a teacher, a parent, a family member, or somebody in the community says, that's not yours, give it back and say you're sorry. And you probably break that rule multiple times throughout your life. That is how you're that is how you're conditioned into liberal values, right? The same thing about freedom of speech. You are taught in school, you don't have to follow what everybody says. Try to be respectful, but you can state your points of views. So all of these liberal values are inculcated into us not via philosophers, but via people in society who couldn't articulate what liberalism is. The old lady who has passed those values on to her children, she wouldn't be able to tell you what liberalism is. She wouldn't have a clue. But nevertheless, she passes it on. She transmits it from one generation to the next. And that's what the essence of liberal society is. It's not the abstraction, it's not the reflection. And so when these people say, oh, this is liberalism as defined by John Locke or John Stuart Mill, yeah, okay, Locke and Mill are part of the conversation, a big part of the conversation, but they're a smaller part of the conversation than the, if you like, the collective wisdom of generations and generations of society, of culture, and how culture is transmitted. And so what they, and by the way, I would object to their ideological objections too, but even if we accept their ideological objections, what they are objecting to is a massive, huge straw man. It's simply not what liberalism is. Neither can it be what they say it is either, because again, the reflections have to come after having seen something to reflect upon.
Are there any requirements, do you think, for the liberal project to continue to work, right? So, for example, you had mentioned earlier about how the advent of MAGA isn't necessarily a reflection that liberalism is failing, but rather that it's thriving or that it's working,
It's
right?
working, yeah.
How would you respond to someone who makes the argument that in order for liberalism to work, in which you have this tradition of like so for example, Jonathan Rauch makes the argument that part of the liberal project is you have like the political liberal project, but then you also have like the civics behind it, right? So he's someone who, even though he's an atheist, he's very positive, and he likes Christianity, and he thinks that ultimately we should have a good number of people who are Christians, and we should adopt the Christian ethic because it works alongside liberalism. But one of his arguments that he makes is that in order for this to work, in order for liberalism to function, the institutions have to work, and we have to maintain trust in those institutions as well as trust in each other, and that's a big portion of liberalism. And if that's the case, how would you respond to someone who makes the argument, well, the big thing that MAGA does that none of the other things, or none of the other, seemingly nefarious movements that have pestilentially spread across the United States does, is that what Trump and MAGA do is that they instill this distrust in the institutions. They distill this distrust in your neighbors, in your crazy woke liberal neighbors, in these crazy woke liberal institutions. And so through executive orders and through like even more fascist takes, he just continues to dissolve liberalism in this way. So how would you respond to someone who makes the argument that, well, MAGA may not necessarily mean that liberalism has failed, but rather that it's clearly weak and it's vulnerable?
So I mean, first of all, you're putting me in a difficult position, right? Because I don't want to defend MAGA. I'm certainly not. I'm not a fan of. I'm not a fan of the ideological excesses of MAGA. But what I would argue is that the ideological excesses of MAGA, for example, are what compared to the ideological excesses of anarchist movements in the United States in the early 20th century. The black shirts and with Oswald Mosley in the UK, in the lead up to World War II, the fascist movement in the UK in the lead up to World War II. These ideological movements have existed before, and there have been more powerful ideological movements within the United States and the United Kingdom that have been illiberal, but have nevertheless been contained within the liberal system. If you wanted to look at specific examples, even within the United Kingdom and much of Western Europe, you could look at examples of genuine Marxists, actual communists who have nevertheless participated within the liberal democratic process. In Japan, presently, there is a communist party in Japan that nevertheless exists and contributes to the liberal system of Japan, and serves a function. The point is that liberalism has always been very, very good at constraining potentially illiberal forces. So what is the point? There is a point in which those forces can become too powerful, and you would need to kind of step in and do something authoritarian. And that was described by Karl Popper, right, in The Paradox of Tolerance. You're aware of that, right? So let's just spell it out to the audience. So the idea is that sometimes this is misunderstood. So what Popper wasn't saying is that if you have some illiberal ideologue who is advocating for an authoritarian society, you don't go and do him in, right? That's not like the first step. The idea is that the state reserves the right to be intolerant and even violent if an ideologue like that becomes sufficiently powerful to threaten the liberal order. So if you're some idiot who's goose stepping to Wagner in your back garden and holding Nuremberg rallies to a couple of homeless people and I don't know, a dog, it doesn't, I don't agree with it. It doesn't mean that what you're saying is positive, but whatever, there's no consequence. But if you transition from, let's say, the homeless person that Hitler was when he was living under a bridge in Berlin, I think, to somebody who is actually threatening to overthrow the Weimar Republic, well, then that's the point that you have to be intolerant. So what I would say is that, is there a danger inherent to MAGA? Yes. Was there a danger? Is there a danger still inherent to the woke left? Yes, too. Do they both have authoritarian tendencies? Absolutely. Are we at the point where we have to be so worried that we should be advocating for violence against these groups? No, I don't think we're nearly there. I don't think we're nearly there at all. And what I would say is that the excesses of these groups, while undesirable, while we'd much rather have sensible centrists talking it through, the excesses are nevertheless an inevitable outcome of the liberal system. And in many ways, they show that the liberal system works, because you can't have these outpourings of political emotion in somewhere like Russia or China, right? You can't have them. And as much as I dislike the woke left and as much as I dislike the woke right, I don't see them as evidence of liberalism's failure. I see it as evidence, if anything, of liberalism's messy success. And I'd rather have that messy success than an authoritarian regime that doesn't have any disagreement whatsoever.
The woke left and woke right are just or their ideologies that have just infected our system. But I'm very curious as to this next point I wanted to discuss with you. Over the last couple of years, we've heard about how wokeness had overtaken the West because of the retreat of Christianity, and we've heard of the substitution hypothesis about how one ideology will rise to fill a vacancy, and how new atheism may have been responsible for the woke. But I find this view to be incredibly disingenuous and put forth by religious apologetics to just make excuses for circumstances that made for these ideologies. Now, I don't think it can be disputed that the right in general is much more religious than those who lean left. But look at what this religion did as a prophylactic against MAGA diehards who are cult like. They make excuses for each and every single thing that Trump does. Now, just to our audience, I'm referring specifically to diehards. I'm not talking about those on the left and right who may have had legitimate concerns and reasons to vote for him. And definitely not to the people who are nuanced, who may agree on one policy or another that he's conducted. Of course, there's nuance there. I'm talking about the people who follow him, which is a cult mentality. There's absolutely nothing he can do wrong. Now, just to be clear, I'm not opposed to the idea of the gatherings and the kind of traditions, the kind of structure that religious based institutions offer. My own stance on these is that they need to be replaced, as I believe the structuring offered by tradition and rituals, which may be based in myths grounded in reality, I think those can actually be healthy. But I just don't want them grounded in some kind of superstitious nonsense that can have less than healthy effects. And in the modern world, with obvious examples, how we treat gay people, women, how do we look at science, etc. That's been a popular narrative, but one that I think is proven even before the happenstance of the woke right. So my question boils all the way down to this: as the woke right really finds its anchors in Christianity as a variant of one of the victimhood identities that they're propping up, doesn't this completely negate the idea that the lack of religiosity has given rise to wokeness? I think it does, but I'd like to hear your take.
Can you make that clearer?
Okay, so the simplest way I can put it is, the argument is that wokeness arise because Christianity retreated.
Okay.
But
Okay.
now that we have, to build on that argument, one ideology comes in to fill another. Now we have the woke right, which is predicated, one of its victimhood identities, on Christianity itself, a religion. And it's been stated that the religion of Christianity itself is a prophylactic against such ideologies. But this is completely disproven, in my opinion, by those who are identify themselves as Christians, who for people who identify themselves as MAGA diehards, and those who put forth their victimhood identity as quote unquote persecuted Christians under the woke right. Religion, in my opinion, in this case, was no prophylactic. So doesn't this
Right.
disprove the idea that
Okay, so
religion? Yeah, yeah,
so that the absence of religion has, so religion's kind of disappeared from the picture, and in
yeah,
its space, wokery has come along.
yeah,
Yeah, I don't really think that religion has disappeared. I mean, it might have disappeared in the sense that there aren't as many people who are going to church, perhaps, but
yeah,
the values of Christian society have evolved. We might not cite Jesus anymore, baby Jesus, and make the sign of the cross everywhere we're going. But they didn't go anywhere. I mean, they're a key part of who we are and the evolution of our society, and the same kind of values that I talked about earlier being transmitted by the old lady to the child, and the child then becomes an old lady, and is part of the process. So no, I don't. This idea that wokery has filled a void, I just don't think that void exists. I actually think that the values of Western society remain quite strong, and I think there's probably empirical evidence for that, isn't there? So, for example, if we look at, I mean, this is like a classic example that people from the woke right would make. They'd claim to be conservatives because they'd say, we've lost these values, and so we need to kind of turn the clock back to a time that we had these values. And they'd probably point to the 1950s. And the reason why they point to the 1950s was because the 1950s was a time when America was growing at a massive rate because of, following from World War II. But if you look at American society of the 1950s versus American society today, I mean, we've seen a kind of uptick in crime and things like that over the past 5 years or so, I think. But if you were to chart a line from 1950 to 2025 and have a look at which society is better off, how much more powerful America is relative to other countries in the world, crime rates, and so on and so forth, if you were to look at it objectively, according to empirical evidence, you'd have to make the point that today's society is more moral, not less moral than it was in the past. And if it is more moral, then values may have evolved, but they can't have gone away. So I mean, I this kind of crisis of meaning, this okay, wokery is a new religion, and the antidote to this crisis of meaning is a new religion. I just dismiss the whole thing.
yeah.
I don't see it. Now, does that mean that individuals don't have a crisis of meaning? No, of course not. Does it mean that groups of people have a crisis of meaning? No, of course not. I mean, I'm not dismissing individual experience, but what I'm saying is across society, I just don't see it.
Mhm. Yeah, that's actually my one of my responses to the book Cross Purposes, by the book that I was earlier referencing with Jonathan Rauch's work, where like I can understand philosophically how some people would have a crisis of meaning after losing their faith, because everything that they understand about where their ethics comes from gets turned up on its head. And I'm sure there
Sure.
are individual cases where that's the case, but when you hear people constantly talk about how the dissolution of Christianity, all at the behest of liberalism, is going to cause this existential angst that's going to permeate through all of society, and you're going to find a bunch of people who are doing immoral acts because now they have no reason to do correct moral acts, right? You no longer have that ought. And my response to that simply is like, but you just don't see that happening, though.
No.
For every person, like I meet, for every one person that genuinely has this existential anxiety that comes from losing their religion and losing their epistemological footing in their ethics, there are 50,000 more people complaining about it. I just don't like. And then when you look at pupils, and I was looking into this after reading Cross Purposes just to like fact check my understanding about what exactly is the sociological reality. No, the vast majority of people who lose a religion just lose it because they no longer believe. They don't leave it because of something bad that happened in their life. They don't leave it even necessarily because they just disagree with the ethics of the books. It's literally just, yeah, they just stop believing naturally. And so, to Jonathan Rauch's point, and I'm curious what you think actually about this, Mike, um because I empathize with Rauch, and I honestly legitimately empathize with this view of Christianity, especially when you hear about the stories of priests who think about leaving their parishes because all people want to talk about when they go into their church is the culture war, and they just want to talk about God. They just want to talk about, personal growth, and they don't want to talk about trans stuff. They don't want to talk about any of the stuff. So I empathize with it. But my response to, Rauch's concern is, Rauch is concerned that without Christianity, you don't have that civic backbone that influences liberalism, because his argument is that liberalism works alongside Christianity. They're not antagonistic. There's tension there, but there's always tension with liberalism, no matter what. But you kind of need that civic backbone, that ethical backbone that kind of influences it. But my response is like, but you just don't see like people going crazy over losing their
So,
religion.
so here's the thing, I agree with him. You do need that civic backbone of Christianity, and it hasn't gone anywhere. Right? Just because it's not being articulated in the terms that it was once articulated doesn't mean that it's disappeared. Right? And if it had have disappeared, if we had have like suddenly become unmoored to the value from the values that had been instilled in us, we would see a dissolution of morality. We would see huge upswings in crime. And we're not seeing that. Like people often ask me if I'm a Christian. Like I'm agnostic about God. But culturally, I'm absolutely Christian. Those are the values that I was raised with. But I wasn't raised going to church or Sunday school or anything like that. I was successfully inculcated into Western liberal Christian values without a need for that to be framed in terms of God. As a teenager, I was a kind of atheist, kind of militant atheist, and I rejected all of this and the idea of God, but it was still rooted in the key values that underpin society. And again, so Roush is going to say, well, okay, liberal society and Christian society, or liberal values and Christian values, are maybe the same thing. I wouldn't disagree. And if we lost those values, then wouldn't that be terrible? Yeah. But then if he's saying that we either have lost them, are losing them, or in danger of losing them, I just don't see that. Now, I might see that if you're going to have immigration from a group of people, for example, who held to absolutely antithetical values. I don't see that happening in America either. But again, this moral collapse that everybody is alluding to, where is it? You can cherry pick, and this is what they do. You can cherry pick some trans nutter on TikTok with blue hair twerking in front of children, and we will all agree that that is clearly inappropriate behavior around children. Just fucking stop. But it doesn't follow. You can't extrapolate from that one example, or even 100 examples, that there is somehow some kind of massive moral collapse in society. Just in the same way that, you can look at African American gangs in the United States, gangs of exclusively African Americans, Bloods and Crips or whatever, who for a long time have been running around killing each other and dealing drugs and doing all kinds of immoral acts. And we can say that those gangs are awful. And we can say that the people who participate them, unless they reform themselves, are also awful. But you don't extrapolate from that every African in the United States should be viewed with suspicion. But this is the kind of logic, where is the evidence of this moral collapse?
Yeah, and I actually agree with your framing. That's something that I've actually changed my mind on, probably the past couple of years, because if someone were to make the argument that, well, the United States is a Christian nation ultimately because all of the values, even stuff like the Golden Rule, which you could say that evolutionarily speaking, game theory, yada yada yada,
Sure.
ultimately it all originated from Judea, originated from Athens, which would be the Ben Shapiro, Christian cultural argument.
Fine.
And to me, it's like, all right, like I disagree probably with your analysis, but I don't care. It's cool, awesome. Those if you identify those values as good, you identify them as Christian values, it's no skin off my back. It's fine, whatever you call it. But my argument would just be that um, the refusal to refer to that specifically as Christian ethics, it just doesn't matter to me. If you want to call it Christian ethics, cool, go for it. Like, it doesn't really matter to me. But at the end of the day, I don't have a good reason to believe that we should be concerned if we start no longer calling these values Christian values, or if we start debating about whether or not those truly are Christian values. It's like the name that we apply to these things just doesn't matter to me anywhere near as much as the actions that actually come from these things. So that is something that I've evolved on.
I'm actually I'm in a state of agreement and disagreement in this case, and like so this is my own issue with it. Is okay. So I said earlier that religion needs to be replaced, because I think like the traditions, the kind of structuring that comes along with these kinds of institutions, for lack of a better term, can be healthy for individuals. Something to graft your life around, something to help evolve yourself as moralistically an individual, as a goalpost to mature towards. But my problem with that is this, and like well, I'll give an example through through some of my recent experiences. 2 years ago, I was invited to attend a Sharaka delegation to Israel. It was an incredibly remarkable experience. It's one I will never forget through my life. Got to tour the country, got to learn about its history. I became a complete fanatic about it when I came home. Read everything I could about the history, the peoples, its founding, its structuring as more or less a liberal democracy. When I was there were outright displays of patriotism. There was the Israeli flag everywhere, everywhere around, and it's a Jewish state, and it's a sanctuary for Jewish people. But Judaism means very, very different things to different people, and the state. I don't believe you can get gay married in Israel, for example. But if you are gay and you are married there, it's celebrated, it's honored. And in Tel Aviv, they have gay pride parades there. It's open, it's fine. Bottom line. But my problem is in the pushback against wokeness. I've heard people define Enlightenment values as Judeo-Christian values, which I think is incredibly disingenuous, because if we've grown more moral, if we are based in quote-unquote Judeo-Christian values, where does someone like Ben Shapiro get his ideas about gay marriage from? Why do we face such a pushback from the religious right against gay marriage in America? And what about the uphill battle we had to fight to get rid of slavery in the Western traditions? If slavery is so outrightly condemned in Christianity, that it should be so obvious as one of the commandments in the Ten Commandments. The bottom line is it isn't. Not even the conservative commentator Thomas Sowell would say that Christianity condemned it. That is a uniquely Western Enlightenment philosophical concept.
It's a uniquely English concept.
What it comes down to, that these are not. The bottom line is these values are not Judeo-Christian. If they've been modified so much, if they've been watered down, if they've evolved past the point, are they truly Judeo-Christian values? And my argument is no. And why are we trying to bring them back into play, unless we want to bring them back into a tradition that we recognize as myth, but nonetheless they have some value in terms of kind of structuring they give. That I'm okay with. That's what I kind of saw. That's what I kind of saw. Excuse me. That's what I kind of sort of saw in Israel when I was there, in variants, of course, but. I don't see the need to call them Judeo-Christian, because from my perspective they are not.
I would argue that they are, but I would argue that they're not solely Judeo-Christian, and that's my problem with somebody like Ben Shapiro. I wouldn't be that. I don't believe that specifically Judeo-Christian values as
Like,
as articulated in the Torah and the Bible. I don't believe that that determines the values of Western society. I would simply say that it's an important part of it.
well, let me give you another example. One that comes from my perspective as a martial artist. I know this has nothing to do with our philosophical
Sure,
discussion
go
here, but
ahead.
I think this example is very, very relevant. There's a debate in the martial arts community whether karate. I'll call it karate for now because it's not. It's the pronunciation that makes sense to most people. Does karate really work? And you see people in kickboxing competitions knocking people out with these fancy kicks, whatever, and they say yes, it works. It's real. It's the truth in combat. But speaking as a martial artist, I disagree with this. Why? It's an art imported from Okinawa. It's evolved. It's an art that came up through America through the 1960s. Something interesting happened in the 1960s. A lot of Western boxers had nothing to do. They came into some of these karate tournaments. What happened? They ended up knocking everybody out. So what happened? Like the Western karate, the Western karateka had integrated Western boxing hands that were scientifically proven in actual combat to really, really work. And what happened, which was what you got was the birth of American kickboxing. What did they throw out? They threw out these fancy hand positions that were never used in any way, shape, or form in realistic combat. The way they stand, these wide horse stances, gone. What they kept were the kicks, which were practical. So they had to discard so much of this art that, like, some people still insist on calling karate when it's really just call it what it is. It's American kickboxing. So I think you see where I'm trying to get at here. Where
I do. I do.
we throw out so much of the quote unquote Judeo Christian religion, the misogyny, the homophobia, etc. And like, if you want to make the claim that this is still Judeo Christian, well, what resembles Judeo Christian's values more, a Western liberal democracy or a fundamentalist Islamic community? And I would argue the latter kind of reflects that.
Okay, so Japan, let's say, throughout seppuku, throughout a strict caste-based system, between the etahini, the merchants, the samurai, and then like the kizoku, the nobles. Um, it threw out so much during the Meiji Restoration, and then continued to throw out a lot more as it turned from what was, I would argue, culturally a very backward place into a vibrant modern liberal democracy. Would we say that the culture is no longer Japanese? So, this is where a conservative liberal point of view would diverge from possibly a traditionally classically liberal point of view. A classically liberal point of view would argue that liberal society exists according to certain universal principles, and the more your society adheres to those universal principles, the better off it will be. A conservative liberal point of view wouldn't reject the possibility of of universal principles, but it would be modest, humble, to the extent that you could make a case for those universal principles and then organize society around them in order to make it better. Again, the extent to which you adhere to them, the better society is, because that was the mistake that was made by Paine and the revolutionaries in France, the Jacobins. What Edmund Burke admired about England wasn't that it had stayed true to certain key principles, but that it had evolved as a society. That he revered, and this is a really important and foundational point of view for conservatism, he didn't revere England because it was old, although it was old. He revered it because it was advanced, because it actually changed quicker than the other societies on the continent were capable of. And the reason that it had done that was because you had things like the Glorious Revolution. You'd removed the centralized power of the monarchy. It could adapt to the demands of the time. As you look at society, as you look at liberal democracy, and this is the key point, by the way, and this is what I'm so glad that you brought up LGBT rights or gay rights. Because I mean, this is the key point where I diverge from a lot of conservatives, and I draw your attention to. I've got one article that I've written in Queer Majority about this, and another one that's forthcoming on this issue. They paid me for it. I'm not sure when it will be published, but well, you never know, right? Is the point that if you look at gay rights, how was it that gay rights became accepted in the United Kingdom and the United States? It wasn't a situation where suddenly Parliament or Congress decided that this was a great idea and then passed laws. It was something that arose very much from the public consciousness. Now, that included, and this draws into the kind of the Trumpist stuff as well, by the way. This included the actions of LGBT radicals going on parades and doing all kinds of stuff, but more than that, it was the quiet conversations around the kitchen table about the guy in the 1960s who grew up calling kids who he didn't like faggots, but then learned to love his gay son. It's the woman in the office who would have sneered when she was younger at a woman wearing trousers, who now says, "That's a nice jacket. Where did you get it from?" It's these gentle changes that led to the general acceptance of gay people. Now, would you call that Judeo-Christian? Would you say that that's not perfectly, but what is Western society? What is Western liberal society? I don't fully disagree with you, and I don't fully disagree with Ben Shapiro either. Ben Shapiro would say it's Judeo-Christian values. I'd say it is, but it's so much more than that. You have the tradition of Athens. You have also the Anglo-Saxon stuff, which is completely disregarded. Nobody talks about the tribal structure of the Anglo-Saxons. There's a huge influence upon, and that's pre-Christian, right? As well as the Athens stuff, and that's a huge influence upon Western liberal democracy too.
Sure.
But it's evolved over generations. Do you call it Judeo-Christian? I'd call it liberal.
And that's my stance. I would not call those Judeo-Christian values, but again, I see the value in in having a very, very watered down version of the church serving as a structure in Western societies. But my struggle is, again, I'll use another one of my stupid analogies. I pour a really thick cup of cappuccino in a tall glass, and I fill it with more and more and more water. So to the point where it has the aftertaste of cappuccino, but it's mostly water. What are we really going to call it then? Are we really going to call it cappuccino or water, or are we going to refer to these as Judeo-Christians?
We're almost getting into
it's a silly analogy, but I see us as being in a more moral state than we were before, because we moved away from some of those, from a lot of what Judeo-Christian value, quote unquote, values are spelled out clearly in the Bible, and how that serves as a prophylactic against the ideologies where we're currently seeing. It just seems disingenuous to me, because if we want to bring back Christianity, then what version do we want to bring back? The 1950s, 1920s, 1800s, or 1900s? And eventually what we want to see is something that moves forward into the future, which more closely represents the fair treatment of peoples that ancient Christianity would have considered evil. Or
I completely agree, and I can answer that question directly. And Edmund Burke was an Anglican, right? Church of England.
Yeah.
The Church of England has ordained gay priests, gay vicars, since the early 2000s, women vicars too. It's a Christian organization that has evolved. Now, there are problems because a lot of wokery has made its way into that organization too, which is unfortunate. But before wokery made its way into that institution, before wokery was even a thing, it was ordaining gay priests and women priests and so on, or vicars as we call them in England. So there are examples of liberal Christian institutions that have evolved in the sense that you're describing. It's not uncommon for you Americans not to see that, because there aren't very many in America that have done that. Whereas in America, Christian religion tends to be a very much more literal thing. That isn't the Christian tradition, by the way, that I grew up with. You know, I was never raised as somebody who believed in specifically in God, but the local vicar, who would have been a guy in his 70s when I was in my when I was 6, 7, 8, something like that, and they would come into school and talk to us about Christ and about Jesus and about the message of Jesus. What they were just, that would have been somebody who was born in the 1930s, right? So what they were describing to me then was a version of Christianity that was far more evolved and advanced than the versions of Christianity that you tend to see in America today.
Yeah, I think the biggest issue for a lot of people, and certainly for me actually, is that when people say or refer to something as Christian values, they're either saying that without Christianity, you wouldn't have these values of gratitude, you wouldn't have these values of grace without Christianity. But then there's other people that said, well, you probably still would have. But just because you still would have, even though you're not a Christian, doesn't mean that Christians don't also have those values, because they are told that they should have those values in the book. And that's what they mean by Christian values. So with someone like Ben Shapiro, he would say the former, that you wouldn't
Right.
have those values. And that's what I'm disagreeing with. If you want to
And I would agree.
associate, those values with Christianity, yeah, too, cool. I don't really care, go for it. But like my philosophical disagreement would just be like, from my point of view, yeah, we evolved to have a certain set of moral principles because they increase the likelihood that we would that we would survive, or that we would be have a good level of well-being. And then along the way, you have multiple religions that come up and they adopt some of those values, but we still continue down that trajectory. And yeah, Christianity adopted good values of the golden rule, of grace, of gratitude, of respect, and stuff like that. Yeah, sure, go for it. Also adopted bad values, right? And so because of that, because I don't believe that those values originated with Christianity, I don't call them Christian values. And when someone comes to the defense of Christian values, it's like, well, what do you mean by that? It really just depends.
I would say that some of them partially originated with Christianity, and I've already mentioned other influences, right? But there is a kind of mic drop moment here to support the broader point that you're making, Vern, which is that as Ben Shapiro points out, that these values, as he argues, cannot exist independent of Christianity or Judaism. Have you ever been to Japan, Ben? Right, less than 1% of the population of Japan are Christian. Have Christian values had an influence on Japan? Absolutely, yeah, because of the Americans and Constitution. So, but it's not the dominant influence, and I don't think anybody would argue that it was a dominant influence on Japan. A famous Japanese author, philosopher, a guy called Nitobe Inazo, wrote a book where he was surprised with Westerners who visited Japan and said, how do you have the value system that you do, that is evident in such a well-ordered society, without explicit adherence to religion? Now, Japan does have religion. At the time, it would have had a very, very few Christians, but there were some that survived the purges of the Edo period. There is also Shinto, which is a kind of animist belief system akin to believing in the Greek gods. You don't even have to believe in them; you just have to go and party with a kami and drink alcohol and stuff. That's all that matters. And then there's Buddhism, which is something that some Japanese people believe in, but the vast majority of people see it more as a set of customs than anything else. And that was true.
Yeah.
Right. And Confucianism which is kind of has much less of an influence on Japan than it does in China. And there's even a slight Taoist influence in Japan too. Yeah. But the point is, it was essentially a practically atheistic society, even back when Nitobe Inazo wrote about it. And so where do these values come from? And the point is of course you can have a society that is completely divorced from Judeo-Christian values and can grow into being a liberal society, not just like America or England, but just as liberal. Right? Japan is just as liberal as Britain is, in my view. And you could make a case that maybe it's not quite as liberal, but clearly it's still a liberal democracy, and a very functional one. So, I wouldn't argue against the influence of Judeo-Christian values. I would be quite protective of them. I'm quite reverent towards Christianity and the influence it's had, and Judaism too. But no, I don't think that they're the exclusive influences on our society. I think they've been helpful, but I don't think that they're essential, because if they were essential, then Japan wouldn't be the kind of country that it is today.
Well, there's still time to change your mind on that and make you a Christian. But regardless, thank you so much, Mr. Burke, for joining us. This was a lovely conversation. I really appreciate it. Just we're coming up
Pleasure's all
on an
mine.
This
hour and
was a lot of
15
fun.
minutes. Want to make sure that we're
A lot of
respectful
fun.
of your time
Yeah.
because your day's barely starting, right?
It is now 1:30.
Wow.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, we always really love speaking with you. Any closing thoughts that you'd like to partake, either you or from Bruce?
No, Mike and I actually met through X Spaces. We got into a nice exchange on X. We moved it over to the private messaging. Then we moved it on to first an online meeting. I just really enjoyed the conversation, and like I love the back and forth we have here, because I thought it was just a great exchange, and like it introduced me to some perspectives, and this is one of the lovelier conversations I've had. So Mike, thank you for joining us. This was great.
Yeah.
I loved
Thank
it.
you so much.
I loved it. Yeah.
Not at all, chaps. The pleasure was all mine, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about some other stuff as well going forward in the future. I'd love to see what you guys think about my takedowns of Hazany and Deneen, for example, and how they claim to be conservative but really are anything but. But yeah, I mean, I'm really happy to talk to you. I'm happy to talk to people who, on the one hand, would recognize that wokery, left-wing wokery, is fundamentally illiberal and remains a problem, and how this mirror image on the right must be tackled at the same time, because there are plenty of people
Yes.
out there who are very, very good at, I mean, the thing that makes me saddest of all is those people who would say, here are the problems with left-wing wokery, and be bang on point again and again and again and again, and really articulate. And then a lot of them would go on to say, and the backlash is coming, and the backlash is going to be absolutely awful, and then would go on to predict just how bad the backlash would be. And they did this years ago. And yet so many of those people are now enthusiastically joining in on it, even though they foresaw it coming and said how bad it would be and predicted everything that we're seeing evolve now. So it's really important to have voices who remain resolutely opposed to left-wing wokery, but at the same time are opposing this kind of pseudo-right-wing, pseudo-conservative mirror image of it. Because if you oppose left-wing wokery, then you have to oppose this stuff that's appearing on the right. Again, the right being used very loosely here.
I don't think you'll find either Vernon and I disagreeing with you, because I think what's really coming out right now is that we're getting a masterclass in a display of who actually has liberal principles and who do not. We're seeing discrepancies in terms of something like free speech, or it's one of the ones that just drives me the craziest, because the ones who are defending free speech because of the woke left cancellations are now the ones who are, all of a sudden now against it for other reasons, because of the stuff that's happening with the extreme or woke right. Which, I mean, they keep saying we're defending liberal values. No, you're not. No, you're not. Yeah, the way you're talking makes it clear you never understood what that meant in the first place. No, you're not.
Or even worse, they did understand, and they're actually betraying it. Yeah. And that's there is some kind of treachery here, and that are there people who misunderstood and are just jumping on the bandwagon or aren't that bright? Of course, and that's bad enough, right? But then there are the people who do understand and who are actually actively betraying not just liberal values, and again, you can call them Judeo-Christian, you can whatever you want to call them. You can make my case that they have multiple sources. You can say maybe they were Judeo-Christian and they've evolved into something else, whatever. But we'll agree that they're liberal values, right? And we will agree that they are the values that have led to, by far and away, the most, with problems, yes, but by far and away the most prosperous, developed, innovative period of human flourishing that there has ever been, by fucking far. and yet these people want to say it's all been a failure. You want to point to the fucking, it's like you want to point to the odd failure here, and there can be quite distressing failures, and use them as evidence that the whole thing is corrupt and we need to tear it all down and replace it with what? By the way, they have no idea.
Yes.
And this is the key point that Edmund Burke made, and it's like, you don't. you have no vision really. You might think that you have a good idea, but when it comes down to it, you don't. And what comes next, if these people win, what comes next will be far worse than the society that exists today.
Yes.
Yes. And that's why they're not conservative. That's why they're radicals, because a conservative point of view would be to understand, yes, there are flaws, and yes, we need to tend to our society and be cognizant of those flaws and try to improve our institutions, of course, right? Because a society that lacks the ability to change can't conserve itself. It can't adapt to a changing world. But we should be reverent. We should be reverent and appreciate these institutions and these things that we have, as flawed as they are, because how much better they are than any alternative, extant or extinct. And if you don't see that, you are not a conservative, and you're not a liberal either, because the opposite of conservatism is not liberalism, right? Liberalism is what defines us in the Anglosphere. The opposite to conservatism is revolutionary. And these people on the left, these woke leftists, are revolutionaries. And the people on the right are revolutionaries. They're not conservative.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself. But Mr. Burke, so where can people find you? Where can people go follow you on not Twitter, X and
X.
Blue Sky and wherever it may be?
I stopped using Blue Sky because I post something and nobody sees what I'm writing. So
I mean, that's me on Twitter, so
yeah. Mike _Burke _UK on Twitter. Where else? I think I've got a Substack. Just type Mike Burke Substack and you'll find that. I hardly ever write anything on that. What else do I do? Yeah, you can find my writings. If you could list some of those pieces, I can send the links over. That would be great. That's about
all those writings will be in the overlay of this video so that they can see it on this video screen right now.
Oh, jolly good.
Click on those links. Yeah. But yeah, Mr. Burke, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure. And yeah, we're incredibly excited for your next appearance where we discuss your tirade against this post-liberal new right philosopher.
Can I just tease this? Can I just tease this a little bit, because this is what is so delicious. So he was firing off all these shots on James Lindsay, basically saying, you can find him on Twitter, right? Basically saying, yeah, come on, James, I'll take you on this point or something. Now you can disagree with James Lindsay on a lot of things, but what you guys probably wouldn't disagree with James Lindsay on is his opposition to the woke right. And so for New Discourses, I published this piece, literally taking the core pieces of his philosophy and going to town on him, right? And this guy whose whole identity is being combative and I'm going to take everyone on, no problem, rah, 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 rah. Guess what his response was to me?
Did he block you?
Oh, he blocked me ages ago. But the piece was published on New Discourse. He blocked me ages ago when I called him a commie for spreading pro-Putin propaganda. But that was fine. But it was now published on New Discourses, and he's trying to pick a point fight with James. We know that he saw it. We know that he saw the article. We know that he read it, because then he started he was even I can't wait to see the article. I can't wait to see the article. And that tweet was deleted. He deleted that tweet after the article was published, by the way. You know, the one I can't wait to see it. So what was his response to me?
Just nothing?
Nothing.
Wow.
Fuck all.
Ghosted you.
He has fuck all to say. And you know why he has fuck all to say? Because every single point, and some of them I've alluded to in this conversation about not what conservatism is and it isn't. And what he argues for, by the way, is this kind of biblical nationalism where we tear up the existing institution, we start to enforce state religion, we have kind of state observation of the Sabbath and all kinds of crazy stuff like that, and he's claiming to be a conservative, and he's not a conservative at all. And I said that in the article, and his response has been crickets. No, because they're full of shit. They're full of shit, these people. They are full of shit. The philosophical backbone of the woke right is completely bankrupt. They have nothing.
That's good. I love that as a soundbite. That's what we're going to have. Mr. Burke, thank you so much. And we're excited to see you in the next episode. Hope you have a great day.
Have a great one,
You
Mike.
too. Bye-bye.